Right, so let's just start. First of all, it's my pleasure to welcome Felicity back to the AA. So I'll run through. So for those of you who don't know, Felicity is an associate professor and the director of the program in critical, curatorial and conceptual practices in architecture at the graduate school at Columbia University. In the past, her work has focused on a variety of things, including issues of radical practice in the 60s and 70s avant-garde, which is through her writing in such figures as Ant Farm and Buckminster Fuller, the role that political, theoretical and curatorial discourses have shaped architecture in her writings on MoMA and many other figures, and questions of the technological transformation within modern and contemporary architecture, thinking specifically of her book, Architecture or Techno-Utopia, which is a tremendous work. In addition, she's also published the Ant Farm Archive, which is another terrific work, and a whole variety of writings. She is also one of the founding editors of Grey Room, a quarterly journal that publishes on a variety of contemporary theoretical discourses, which since 2000, which continues its tremendous work. So it's my pleasure to welcome Felicity today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. It's a great pleasure to be back speaking here. So what I'm going to present on today is material from a forthcoming book that's called Outlaw Territories, Environments of Insecurity, Architectures of Counterinsurgency. And the sort of broader scope of this project is to, it's bracketed by the years 1966 to 1979. And ambition is to look at these moments where architecture becomes sort of articulated with issues of territorial insecurity and so-called human unsettlement. And this piece is actually from the second last chapter of the book, and it really offers some thoughts on the emergence of Nicholas Negroponte's architecture machine group at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and in particular a reading of the way in which it became inscribed in counterinsurgency research and so-called big science in that context. I'm just going to, okay, so to begin. And the images are a little challenged, so I apologize about them. In September 1969, Progressive Architecture published a profile on MIT's Urban Systems Laboratory entitled, as you see, In Search of Urban Expertise. It asked the question, and I quote, "Can the university perform for the cities the same kind of research and development functions that it has so successfully performed for NASA and for the Department of Defense? Can it work productively with city governments and industry to solve the difficult problem of the country's unmanageable metropolitan centers? The Massachusetts Institute of Technology, for one, is setting out to prove that it can." Drawing upon the recommendations of a Ford Foundation-sponsored faculty committee report on urban affairs, the USL was founded in 1968 as, and I quote, "a new interdepartmental and multidisciplinary activity to mobilize institute-wide resources in the area of urban systems." As one USL report put it, quite simply, tying the establishment of the lab to the period's unrest, think of the late 1960s, MIT responded to the urban crises of the 1960s by founding the Urban Systems Lab. Indeed, the USL was to play a key role in MIT's attempts to bring expertise developed in its engineering and social science labs for military agencies and the country's space program to bear on the domestic front. And the character of its work, particularly in the fields of architecture and planning, would be very much marked by that military legacy. This transfer of skills was not, according to its director, a man called Charles Miller, unique to a university setting at that moment. And he said, "Many technology companies are in the process of doing precisely what the Institute is doing," he remarks, "creating a mechanism whereby those skills and assets acquired working for the problems of defense and the space program can be transferred to the problem of cities." And we'll see this sort of refraction back, in effect, as I'll argue a little bit later, refraction back onto a sort of fear of African-American populations in urban centers. So the intimate triangulation then of the military, industrial, corporate, and academic sectors was, as associate editor of Progressive Architecture, Alice Runge noted in her profile on the USL, precisely what qualified MIT to operate at the forefront of defense against the so-called urban crisis. And she explains, the faculty is liberally salted with men whose careers straddle the academic industrial consulting line and includes a number of returnees from Washington's advisory elite who still contribute more than their fair share to the support of the Boston-Washington air routes. So what characterized the USL's ambition, as Runge stressed repeatedly, was urban action, or what she called the practical application of scientific knowledge and technology. Designating the new urban unit as a laboratory rather than a center, she explained, was not a random choice, suggesting that the terminology reflects the action-oriented thinking that is everywhere affecting the form of American institutions. We are not going to be simply another center studying the city, but a group of people that are trying to do something about the problems, Charles Miller asserted. He referred to this application of academic research as making technology work in the city. And he went on to characterize the goal of USL as developing methodologies that would help reduce or even close what he called an enormous gap between research, the university kind of research in particular, and the city. Miller stressed this point when interviewed by MIT student newspaper that you see here, The Tech, in April '68, on the occasion of the lab's opening. As Jay Coonan reported in Urban Lab to Aid America's Cities, Miller had insisted that the style of the institute is different from that of other universities. It is interested in being more than a city scholar and is actually closer to being action-oriented than other schools. Yes, this is the rhetoric. So through this attention to American cities, he claimed, MIT was shifting its focus of research from strictly military applications to the domestic realm. So in 1967, the Ford Foundation awarded MIT a $3 million grant as part of a program called University Urban Studies. $800,000 of this was dedicated to founding USL. To understand the Ford Foundation's interest in funding the lab, we need to ask what types of technology and scientific research were to be put to work in the city, and of course, for whom and to what ends. So Urban Lab to Aid American Cities, as you see here, it appears symptomatically adjacent to the issue's cover story, Columbia seized by students. In his 1968 report, Miller indicated that the lab provided an outlet for such concerns. Students turning to USL are particularly anxious to relate their academic study programs to real problems and urban issues, and they look to USL, he explained, for a coupling with action in the cities. Yeah? So the students also, it's a type of palliative measure involving them in this pernicious research. So the following year, he pointed to the palliative nature again of students' involvement. In some ways, urban unrest and student unrest are connected, he explained. At least many students now view urban-oriented involvement as relevant and socially desirable, and their involvement in USL projects has always been high among our priorities. With concern growing over the Institute's contributions to the nation's burgeoning war machine, and just as the arts and humanities had earlier been mobilized as a panacea to rising fears of an unchecked technocracy at MIT, the Institute now attempted to deploy so-called urban action as a conciliatory mechanism. The Ford Foundation had, of course, long been known to act as a CIA front for funding research, particularly in the applied social sciences, research that fed a national security strategy, then shifting its focus towards social engineering on the civilian front, not only internationally, but increasingly within the domestic sector. And indeed, when we look more carefully, we find the USL situated precisely at the junction of urbanism, social engineering, developmentalism, counterinsurgency, communication, and citizen participation, together cast as mechanisms of ensuring the goal of political stability, or in their cybernetic terms, of political homeostasis. As might be evident in the very naming of the lab, the conception of urban had also undergone a significant transformation. The object of research was no longer the material city, its history, or its inhabitants in the traditional sense of the terms, but rather the pursuit of paradigms of analysis, modeling, and simulation of environments as multiple urban systems. The lab's annual report from 1968 attempted to clarify just what was meant in this regard. And I quote, "The scope of urban systems is defined initially as the advancement and utilization of the methods of systems analysis, systems engineering, information systems, and related advanced capabilities and technologies applied to the planning, design, construction, and management of the facilities and services required for urban living, including transportation, and what they called environmental control, housing, health, and others." So this paradigm of science and technology being put to work in the service of environmental control and the management of the population, its health, housing, education, productivity, of course, for capitalism, situates us, of course, in the very realm of what Michel Foucault would theorize in the 1970s as biopolitical regulation. Here we find the academy, that is, working in the service of developing tools for advancing a form of governmental rationality and its micro-political techniques of power as they met the subject, or the psyche and the body, we should say, of the subject in its everyday environment. Sorry, just lost my place here. And it's not incidental in this regard that Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn, New York, and Roxbury in Boston, both largely economically underprivileged African-American communities, soon became key objects of USL analysis, key sites for such urban systems research, and potentially its application as managerial tools for social and environmental control. As the USL report for 1969-1970 explained, Professor Frank Jones, Associate Director of USL, was now running the Technology, Race, and Poverty Project, which was working with community organizers in Boston's South End and with the Metropolitan Applied Research Center, so-called MARC, to assist in the study of urban ghettos as systems. So Miller stated in 1968 that MIT had considerable expertise in organizing interdepartmental and interdisciplinary research and project laboratories in engineering and applied science. Yet the USL was, as he noted, the first endeavor to actively script such an interaction between architecture, planning, management, the social sciences, and engineering on a major scale. This recasting of the school's role within the institutional milieu of MIT to become part of an organized interdisciplinary framework dedicated to developing techniques of controlling urban and environmental systems and the populations who inhabited them, their monitoring, quantitative description, regulation, management, organization, and visualization, marked what appears in retrospect to be a profound shift. No longer were architects simply drawing upon multiple fields of expertise in order to facilitate their design work in the context of a transforming modernity. Rather, the discipline had become one more parameter in a general systems paradigm geared towards environmental control in the interests of national security, part, as we'll see, of a counterinsurgency technology or strategy, and inextricably coupled with heavily funded research into the application of computer technologies and scientific knowledge. So architecture, is, as I'm arguing, is becoming inscribed within the domain of big science. So it was through this transformation that possibilities of lucrative contract-based research funding from federal agencies and institutions like the Ford Foundation, in fact, opened up. And we'll go on to argue this is what allowed for the Architecture Machine Group to do its early computer research. So concluding her account of the USL in PA, Runge noted, "Finite individual concerns are not the province of those whose task it is to devise universal patterns of order for complex social, physical, and economic systems." Still, she added in closing, indicating a certain hesitation or unease, one hopes that somewhere along the way to the execution of large-scale dreams, there will be someone who will plug in the right architect at the right place. And at stake here, in many regards, is precisely this question of what the right architect might look like at this moment. One characterized not only by increasing territorial insecurity, but, and not unrelated to this, by the expanding reach of information technology and the emergence of new mediated forms of social and territorial organization, coupled with new techniques of management. In its contribution to the Ford Foundation proposal, the Department of Architecture at MIT suggested that under the impact of contemporary pressures, the designer no longer had control over his product. The elements that invite his manipulation are more extensive, they explained, no longer limited to the building as an object. Adding, individual buildings become part of a continuum held together by structures at a macro scale, whose complexities must become part of the designer's vision. So how might such an architect then, or their vision, plug into such an expanded and increasingly less material apparatus of micropolitical control, that continuum held together at the macro scale? How might they do so from a disciplinary perspective that we would still recognize as architecture? What role, that is to ask, might architecture play once interpolated within a systems paradigm bent on the instrumentalization of disciplinary knowledge in the service of this paradigm of security? So Miller, to turn to the question of the computer, Miller indicated that what brought the diverse activities of the USL together, their so-called common denominator, was the computer, or computer-based urban research. Access to an experimentally oriented computer was, Miller explained, essential to new research in urban information systems, urban simulations, and urban design, as planned by groups in the USL. In 1968, those computer resources took the form of an IBM System 360 Model 67 time-sharing computer that you see here, a mainframe to which various USL groups had access via remote consoles. As announced in a press release, it was operated under CP67 and the Cambridge Monitor System, jointly developed by the MIT's Lincoln Laboratory and the IBM Cambridge Scientific Center. At the time, a highly advanced multi-user computer with a notable capacity of being able to simulate multiple virtual machines, the S36067 was configured with the then impressive statistics of 512 kilobytes of storage, which is less than, of course, a basic Word document at this point. So the School of Architecture and Planning hosted a number of USL-directed research projects in the lab's first year, as reported by the two associate directors affiliated with the school. This was Aaron Fleischer from Planning and Don Lynn Linden from Architecture. Fleischer noted 4 major projects in the Department of Planning: William Porter's computer program called Discourse, which was an urban data system, another project called Choice, and we find the rhetoric is always that, of choice and liberation and participation, as well as a project called an urban data laboratory. They're also sponsoring the studies in the psychology of perception under Kevin Lynch and others, and work on the Boston Model Cities program. So in December '67, in a letter to Miller, political scientist Professor Ithiel de Solapool identified the Boston Model Cities program as, in fact, the candidate for the very first investments of the USL funds on account of its potential value. It was basically an idea to produce a data bank and affiliate this with a situation room, and this would be the initial goal of the lab. With the city and its population understood as components within information or cybernetic systems, computerized data banks would be crucial, and citizen participation in producing them the most effective means of feedback-based stabilization. So formally affiliated with Stanford's Hoover Institute, it's a conservative right-wing think tank, and founding chair of MIT's Political Science Department, Poole's research and the projects, centers, and laboratories he participated in exemplified precisely the focus on military and intelligence techniques and international developmental policy, as well as the logic of transferring them to the domestic front in the wake of civil rights struggles. He was, for instance, a key player in the establishment of Project Cambridge in 1969 with the Center for International Studies, a DARPA-funded initiative, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency of the U.S. Department of Defense, a project to develop computer-based applications in the behavioral and social sciences. And so, along with USL, Project Cambridge was sponsored Porter's Discourse, so this was all very much part of the same milieu. Linden reported 3 primary areas of USL-sponsored research in architecture, what they called communication and urban problem solving, computer-aided urban design, and environmental planning for VSTOL, which you see here is the vertical short takeoff and landing transportation project, a counterinsurgency technology that they were developing for use in Southeast Asia and Latin America. Of these 3 research areas, Miller singled out development in computer-aided urban design as most notable. announcing the following year that work on the development of an architecture machine, a special purpose satellite device with local memory and local processing ability, capable of interacting with the Institute's large IBM machine, 36067, is being developed by Nicholas Negroponte and Leon Greusser with USL support. So I want to turn then to the founding of the computer-aided design field at MIT, for its stake was not simply the development of a computer-based graphic interface for design, something like the replication of the design process from sketching to working drawings where it began, but a much more thoroughgoing paradigm of data collection and management, and in turn of environmental simulation in the virtual realm that was to be integrated with military research. Negroponte and Greusser's research began here in 1966 with a project called Urban 2, developed in collaboration with the IBM Scientific Center when Negroponte worked following his graduation from MIT's master's program. And his master's thesis was called The Computer Simulation of Perception During Motion in the Urban Environment, and was put forward as a new paradigm of architectural research, and it also built upon his undergraduate thesis, which I'll come back to, a thesis that was motivated by a fear of population growth in the third world. His sort of core argument there was that a new profession had to evolve that would, as he put it, take responsibility for handling urbanization of millions and millions. So Urban 2 provided the platform for Negroponte's inaugural course in fall 67 called Special Problems in Computer-Aided Urban Design. A course description from January of 1967 explained that students would work towards establishing a coordinated system that aids the direct design process we usually associate with yellow tracing paper. Urban 2 was, as they explained in these early documents, to be a conversational computer system in which the computer was conceived as, and I quote, a partner in this procedure by providing a design service that monitors the process rather than optimizing or analyzing input. Students were given a pre-scripted graphical language using this 10-foot cube building block system that operated with a sort of broader three-dimensional orthogonal grid. The manipulation of cubes, as Negroponte explained, provides a way of simulating the urban design process, to which he added, it furnishes a frictionless vacuum environment in which to work, an environment with no forces, no social, political, or even other environmental forces. So sponsored by USL and soon called Urban 5, the application made quite a stir at the first Design Methods Group Conference in spring 1968, held in collaboration with Harvard's Graduate School of Design and MIT's Department of Civil Engineering. In his review of the conference, called Glass Box and Black Box, Jonathan Barnett declared Urban 5 to be the most spectacular example of blackboxmanship at the conference, referring to the manner in which the project retained a conventional approach to design, simply augmenting it through new tools. Barnett pointed in particular to the device's inherent drive towards what he called a conciliatory process, noted that it provides a sophisticated and flexible format that actually adjusts to the idiosyncrasies of an individual designer. As he recounted, films shown with 3 projectors documented a novice's first encounter with Urban 5, which is programmed to make kindly comments like, "I'm afraid you have a conflict here, Ted." The user types in his name, and it sits down when he sits down at the console. So the computer knew who was speaking, and he went on, "Ted, how long are you going to postpone resolving this conflict?" So here, indeed, as Lyndon suggested, was the new order of designer-machine interaction. So Urban 5 was designed, as the team explained at the conference, to be a monitoring device, or what they called an eavesdropping mechanism, that tried to eradicate conflicts by steering the architect toward a set of predetermined normative parameters, while learning from interaction with so-called humans. Negroponte recalled a few years later that he had initially understood the computer's role as checking for violations in constraints and criteria which had been predetermined by the architect. This modality of conversing with the computer might give us pause, and seems not unrelated to the architect's desire to furnish a frictionless vacuum environment in which to work. For while even the first instance, they were simply setting up what they referred to as a launching vehicle or a research toy to test rather banal architectural parameters like numbers of bedrooms, structural feasibility, etc. The experimental mode of simulating environments without the friction of the real world, which they likened to laboratory experiments in Newtonian mechanics, would, it seemed, leave a profound mark on the conception of architecture, instituting forms of abstraction that characterized the environments they sought. The underlying technical logic of such systems, that is, could translate all too easily into a paradigm in which historical and political valences would simply be swept aside in favor of a smoothly functioning apparatus, whether architectural, administrative, political, etc. That is to say, to eliminate conflict is to close down any space for political or contestatory participation. So Lawrence Anderson noted in his 1968 report to the School of Architecture that the architecture machine, and we're seeing the technology develop, this is the sort of core computer in the architecture machine lab. So he explained that the architecture machine is a phantom in the minds of Professors Grosser and Nicholas Negroponte that is becoming concrete with disconcerting haste. By 1969, as reported in a search for urban expertise on work on Urban 5 had in fact been declared complete, and a second generation of studies was already underway. As Runge explained, and I quote, "One of the more interesting, though least practical groups of projects under the leadership of the Architecture Machine Group is searching for nothing less than artificial design intelligence. The architecture machine, as it's called, is to be a moral animal and a design partner to the architect, capable of carrying on a man-machine dialogue in the manner of an associate having the potential for self-improvement." Now formalized as the Architecture Machine Group, and with their research sponsored by the Ford Foundation and Interdata vs. USL, research funding that will later extend to ARPA, to the Air Force, the Office of Naval Research, and other military bodies, Negroponte and his students had, under the impact of Marvin Minsky, Oliver Selfridge, and Seymour Papert, all very much leaders in the field of artificial intelligence, turned to explore questions of artificial intelligence that might be pertinent to design. So they'd already moved from design as such to a very different paradigm. The group's focus, Miller reported that same year, was now on the problem of interfacing both between computer and man and computer and the so-called real world. Artificial intelligence, or what Negroponte referred to as ultra-intelligence in computers, was approached by breaking up the design problem, understood as a process of monitoring and representing the environment, into systematic components, what they called machine vision, sketch recognition, interfaces with the non-professional, computer graphics, tactile sensors and effectors, low-resolution interfacing, and three-dimensional input and output. So if the ambition was to create more flexible and more responsive computer programs, what emerged was a paradigm of interfacing that, as it turns out, required the extensive acquisition and processing of ever more detailed information, both of man and of his real world. Moreover, even after collecting such environmental data through those real-world sensors, that frictionless vacuum environment was not replaced by either aesthetic or socio-historical materials so much as by other applications. Under the subtitles Computers in Search of Identity, Runge offered, this is the one from PA, Runge offered a succinct description of research then underway as part of this shift toward questions of artificial intelligence. These were later to be described in further detail in Negroponte's 1970 book-length account of the early research called The Architecture Machine. A computerized robot called Grope, she explains, actually I was right on here, Grope, Runge explains, is a toy tank with photoelectric eyes that are being trained to search out interesting places, points of greatest diversity on urban maps, and may someday lead to a mechanical design partner that can seek out information about the real world without human supervision. The next project, called C, was a computerized television camera that studies various groupings of 2-inch by 2-inch blocks that was supposed to represent urban modules, and then devises its own configurations. A program is being developed for a computer that can interview people about their environment, the ultimate goal being to hook into the public phone system. Negroponte sees this one as an important step towards universal advocacy. The design of the city can start to reflect every single inhabitant, he explained, his needs and his desires. This may seem completely ludicrous, but I don't think it is." End of quote. So Negroponte's step toward universal advocacy was illustrated by an image of an African-American man at a typewriter-like device. The caption reads, "Ghetto resident talks to computer about slum environment via typewriter computer terminal," another of architecture professor Negroponte's artificial intelligence projects. As revealed the same month, which is September 1969, in a special issue of the British magazine Architectural Design, dedicated to the disciplines interface with contemporary sciences like cybernetics and operations research, this project was called Interact. Edited by Royston Landau, the special issue of AD featured experiments in computer-aided design report from the Department of Architecture at MIT. Along with a report on space arrangement research led by Tim Johnson, it covered research then being sponsored by USL, including Porter's Discourse, John Bourne's Choice, as well as the Architecture Machine Group's projects called GROPE, C, and C was soon renamed SEEK, and we'll come back to that, as well as Interact. The introductory description proposed that machines and automation in general might provide some of the omitted and difficult to acquire information needed for good design, as had been the case with human architects. But it stressed that some information might still be missing. Consequently, they went on, the Architecture Machine Group are embarking on the construction of a machine that can work with missing information, one that could understand human metaphors, solicit information on its own, talk to a wide variety of people, acquire experience, and even be intelligent. The brief prospectus was followed by a reprint of Negroponte's Towards a Humanism Through Machines, in which he described the desired process of mutual evolutionary exchange as an acquaintanceship of two intelligent systems, the architect and the architecture machine, a relationship that would not take the form, he explained, of a master-slave, but rather of two associates which each have potential for self-improvement. Computer-aided design, he stressed, distinguishing it from simple processes of computerization, would not leave either party untouched, since, as he explained, it concerns an ecology of mutual design, complementarity, augmentation, and substitution. Negroponte returned to this question of responsiveness and of participation in concerning responsive architecture, concerning responsive architecture, his concluding remarks to the shirt sleeve session in responsive house building technologies coming out of a conference at MIT from 1972 and published, as you see here, as The Responsive House. He began by noting that there were many forms of responsiveness. There was responsive design technology that people were talking about, participation, advocacy planning, responsive building technologies, and finally, what he was dreaming of, responsive architecture itself. The latter, he clarified, entailed the removal of all middlemen, including architects. To explain what he meant, he recalled having recently attended a conference in England on design participation, in which he witnessed two primary orientations, what he called design methodologists and what he called advocacy planner types. The former, the design methodologists, sought information from the social sciences, and he said, "We want the psychologists, sociologists, and anthropologists to tell us more about what people want. We want people to fill out our questionnaires. We want to know more so that we can design better buildings." This is him sort of ventriloquizing. The latter, he went on, had taken an activist role, which he characterized as, "We are going to get people heard. We're going to help them affect the design of their environment." Both Negroponte assessed were paternalistic, as had his own project Urban 5 been. His other solution was a physical environment which has knowledge about you. This was an idea then being provisionally tested on the lab's door at MIT with a device called Greet, one that was designed to recognize people, an apparatus that he explained invoking the cybernetician Gordon Pask, with a so-called U-sensor. But this, too, was only the first step for Negroponte. He was seeking an environment that could also have a predictive capacity, a predictive ability with respect to one's needs, desires, intentionality, etc. So it's not surprising, he speculated, that people remain suspicious of such responsive environments, giving the paucity of adequate examples. He goes on, unfortunately, examples such as floors that can tell how many people are dancing on them, or doors that can recognize people, usually end up driving second-rate light shows or doing very banal things in directing physical environments. What he considered to be the only genuinely architectural response was Sean Wellesley Miller's design of a sculptural exhibit that you see here, which counted the number of people that went into it and would inflate or deflate according to the number of people. Just moving along here. So preempting contemporary personal data tracking applications, Negroponte concluded by pointing to paradigms of operational responsiveness that were more convincing, even if not realized yet in the architectural domain, what he called lots of little surrogate applications of me. I hate reading newspapers and looking at news on the television, he explained, but I would love to have some sort of device which knew me well enough to synopsize the news each night and tell me if there happens to be something interesting on television today or tomorrow without me having to read TV Guide. They're already dreaming of the type of data collection that we're all too familiar with. So, to come back to Interact. With ArcMax Interact and the group's work on interfacing with the so-called non-professional, we find ourselves at the crux of research operating at the nexus of the so-called urban crisis, computers, and the social sciences funded by USL. Interact, as reported in AD, faces the problem of soliciting information about the environment, about needs and desires from the inhabitants themselves. The project's primary researcher was a man called Richard Hesdorfer, who had just graduated from MIT's architecture program and was developing what he called this consumer item that could initiate a dialogue with inhabitants, build a model of their needs and desires, particular to any speaker, and then report back to the architecture machine. And this language of desire is absolutely pervasive in this literature. So as the brief account in AD recalled, the experiment involved taking a teletype writing device into Boston's South End, described here as Boston's ghetto area. And I quote, the inhabitants of the neighborhood were asked to converse with this machine about their local environment. Though the conversation was hampered by the necessity to type in English sentences, the chat was smooth enough to reveal two important results. First, the three user inhabitants said things to this machine that they would probably not have said to a human, particularly a white planner or politician. To them, the machine was not black, was not white, and surely had no prejudices. Second, the three residents had no qualms or suspicions about talking with the machine in English about their personal desires. They did not type uncalled for remarks. Instead, they immediately entered a discourse about slum neighborhoods, highways, schools, and the like. End of quote. So although not revealed initially, the user inhabitants were Maurice Jones, Barry Adams, and Robert Qualls, the later wearing the so-called tenant power badge. In July of 1969, Negroponte included a further description in the inaugural issue of the school's new publication called Research. Interact, he explained, is a project that explores natural language communication between actual users or users-to-be of a physical environment and machine advocacy planners. The romantic notion of people designing their own homes, their own choices, their physical environments, all with rapid change and growth, is the underlying goal. At present, the system exhibits a very false intelligence and is primarily a wordy conversationalist. However, the goal is to build a model of the speaker's needs and desires and to provide a mirror of his requirements and aspirations and to get to know him, end of quote. So Negroponte's suggestion that the system of data extraction still exhibited a false intelligence, that it remained a wordy conversationalist, was perhaps a reference to a conceit at the heart of this project. As revealed parenthetically in AD, the reader should know, as the three users did not, that this experiment was conducted over telephone lines with teletypes with a human at the other end, not a machine. The same experiment will be rerun shortly, this time with a machine at the other end of the telephone line. In 1973, Negroponte revealed the identities of those humans on the other end of the telephone line to be architects. So Negroponte's remarks on the user participation and advocacy planning also remind us of the degree to which ArcMac's ambitions remain indebted to the work of the metabolists and GM, particularly that of Yona Friedman. Following their initial meeting in 1964, when Negroponte, who could speak French, was sent to pick him up at the airport, Friedman's spatial city became a key reference in Negroponte's undergraduate thesis of 1966 called Systems of Urban Growth, and he would become a long-standing collaborator with the ACMAC group. The three-dimensional matrix structuring Friedman's spatial city would be reiterated initially, as we saw, as the mechanical framework, or here, as we see here, as the mechanical framework in Negroponte's mover grid, a study derived also from metabolism. The grid, Negroponte explained, in that context, merely defines a point in space that in turn describes potential volumes within which components would be jacked into place. But that matrix can also be read to persist in the cubes of Urban 5 and other systems-based environments that Negroponte built in that seemingly frictionless vacuum of the virtual realm, and which also suggests the degree to which this research uncannily harbors the memory of the period's experimental practice while taking it in a very different direction. Referring to Moshe Safdie's famous megastructure for Expo 67 in Montreal, Negroponte acknowledged that Urban 5 had in fact mimicked the additive genre of composition popular in schools of architecture at the time and epitomized in habitat. It did this comprehensively, smoothly, and expensively, he put it. Moreover, he indicated that this desired shift to an advocacy model of user participation via the automation of artificial intelligence, and with it the eradication of the architect from the equation, had received the serious attention only of Yonah Friedman. Introducing the English language of Friedman's Towards a Scientific Architecture of 1975, Negroponte alluded to, and I quote, the paradoxical intersection of two academic streams, participatory design and scientific methods, too frequently held apart by the circumstances of our training, implying, however, that his own position was somewhat closer to the scientific end of this conflict. As he put it, Yonah Friedman has used a mathematical scaffolding to support philosophical positions in a manner that affords the reader the opportunity to disagree with his utopian posture, but still benefit from his techniques. He's separating out the scientific and the political and assuming only the scientific aspect of this work. That year, and very much indebted to Friedman's Flatrider project, Friedman acted as a consultant to ACMAC on a project entitled Architecture by Yourself, and an application entitled Yonah. But by 1975, as Negroponte must have been aware, the logic of participation and that informing feedback-based processes of scientific research or scientific methods were hardly so opposed. For any avowedly idealistic goal of user-controlled systems of organization, to reiterate, was easily transposed into a form of participation in which the ever more precise extraction of data or information about the human subject, their needs and desires, would be extracted and fed back into an intelligent machine. Indeed, this very logic had been the most evident lesson of the architecture machine group's contribution to software, information technology, its new meaning for art. A famous exhibition of conceptual art held at the Jewish Museum in New York in 1970. Software, as its curator Jack Burnham explained, responded to life in a computerized environment. The exhibition aimed to demonstrate the effects of contemporary control and communication techniques in the hands of artists. Research work in Negroponte's experimental architectural laboratory, however, had little in common with the critical, artistic, and institutional-driven conceptual art practices at this time. Yet it shared the exhibition's focus on systems and process-based work, engaging communications and cybernetic paradigms through which individuals might interact with one another and with their environment. So other contributors include Sonia Sheridan, Hans Hake, Vida Aconci, Les Levine, Ellen Capra, and Lawrence Weiner. Hake, for instance, presented visitors' profile and news, the former collecting, tabulating, and outputting data on visitors who interacted with the installation, the latter a teletype printout of national and foreign news services. Levine installed systems burn-off, residual software, comprised of photographs from the equally famous Earthworks exhibition the year before at Ithaca, and speaking to the informatic residuals transmitted through media, along with AIR, which was live feed from the artist's studio, and a project called Wiretap, which speaks of sort of broadcasting a series of wiretapped telephone conversations. For the software show, Negroponte presented Seek as a servo mechanism connected to the architecture machine and designed to, as he put it, handle local unexpected events occurring within an environment comprised of 2-inch cubes that served as the habitat for a colony of gerbils. They're like little rodents, as you see. As he explained, Seek attempted to go beyond the real-world situation, where machines could not respond to the unpredictable nature of people, gerbils, so he's literally collapsing these two terms. Today, machines are poor at handling sudden changes in context and environment. This lack of adaptability, he argued, is the problem that Seek confronts in diminutive. So offered to the viewer, then, as an exercise in the benefits of artificial intelligence, one in which the computer architect had replaced the human architect, who was no longer able to deal with the complexity of his environment, Seek was to demonstrate in miniature optimized relations between humans, their actions, and the new computerized or virtual milieu. The 10-foot blocks had returned as 500 2-inch cubes to be tested in a 5 by 7-foot real-world situation that was perhaps best understood as an allegorical simulation of environmental control. Negroponte's intelligent machine would read the desires of the animals as registered in their random displacement of blocks, and then the computer-controlled robotic device would straighten the blocks in new locations. The outcome, as he wrote, was a constantly changing architecture that reflected the way the little animals used their place. That is, the computer was supposed to learn how to read the indeterminate actions and the fluidity of the environment as having underlying meanings, and would then operate to recalibrate its organization of the blocks according to this newly detected set of parameters. Within this pernicious circuit, it was exactly via their interaction with their environment and the feedback of this monitored data that the gerbil might facilitate the computer's learning process and hence cede his control over the transformation of the environment to the architecture machine. Negroponte later conceded that the technology was not yet sophisticated enough at the time for the architecture machine to actually learn in an evolutionary sense and was merely evaluating probabilities. But his attempts to produce such an environmental mechanism rendered the gerbils perfectly allegorical of the potential evacuation of agency and of space for political negotiation at the hands of cybernetic machines, as had been modeled by Interact. When Negroponte described Interact in the architecture machine in 1970, he added the somewhat troubling suggestion, and I quote, "With these domestic and domesticated machines, the design task becomes one of blending the preferences of the individual with those of the group. Machines would monitor the propensity for change of the body politic. Large central processes, parent machines of some sort, could interpolate and extrapolate the local commonalities by overviewing a large population of consumer machines," end of quote. The formulation of such a surveillance device, connected as they imagined through the telephone system and avowedly dedicated to a normative ideal, that of blending the preferences of the individual with those of the group, is certainly enough to make one nervous. Negroponte attempted to defer such a reaction by pointing to the machine's capacity to make ever more fine-grained distinctions among subjects, but in so doing perhaps revealed the disturbing proximity of the application, of its application to domestic security. And I quote again, "What will remove these machines from a brave new world," he remarks, "is that they will be able and must search for the exception in desire or need, the one in a million. In other words, when the generalization matches the local desire, our omnipresent machines will not be excited. It's when the particular varies from the group preferences that our machine will react, not to thwart him, but to service it." But what sort of decisions, we might ask, might such a computer, even an architecture machine programmed to be a so-called ethical robot, really help to make, believing that it was on your own behalf? How exactly might they service your desires? The ArcMac group returned to this question of interfacing with the non-professional in a project called Computer Aids to Participatory Architecture, a 1971 proposal to the National Science Foundation, or NSF, for research to be undertaken with USL. The document concluded by returning to Seek, including the page from the exhibition software and further details on 6 operations through which the software would control hardware, as you see here, generate, degenerate, fix it, straighten, find, error detect, etc. The project abstract, published in a 1971 directory, noted that the outcome of a scenario within the system would not so much be an instant house plan as it would be a model of the user, i.e. his needs and desires. Here, too, we begin to see the departure from that instant house plan that Friedman had sought in his Flatrider project. So in the NSF proposal, however, the group clarified that here technology would replace politics. And I quote, "We're not proposing to do computer-aided advocacy planning. We propose to take a step toward allowing the urban dweller to participate in the design of his own environment by multiplying the ability of design services rather than mobilizing political power," end quote. Again, the group used the photographs from Interact, albeit not naming the project in the proposal, to demonstrate the means of eliciting information. Since the basic premise of this proposal is that our users cannot express all their needs and desires explicitly, the machine must determine most of them implicitly. Those needs and desires would be precisely the data needed to feed back into the system in order to ensure political homeostasis. So if to stress this inscription of the user within an ever more extensive data-driven feedback device was initially cast as a computer-mediated form of advocacy planning, such remarks, along with the trajectory of funding for such research, indicates that we might also question a certain knowingness regarding its military or its counterinsurgency potentials. Negroponte himself, when working on the establishment of the next project, he worked on the Arts and Media Technology program, which would eventually become the Media Lab, which is still running today, suggested that he had become all too aware of these resonances. He said, "The idea is to encourage the most advanced media research without the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde tone implicit in arts and humanities research done conjointly with military and industrial sponsorship." So as Negroponte recognized, the dream of a computer-controlled environment replete with integrated sensor and surveillance technology, computer-assisted data processing and evaluation, and automated prosthetic devices resonated all too eerily with General Westmoreland's ambition to achieve a soldierless battlefield of the future in Vietnam, a super-efficient, computerized, and totalizing electronic battlefield designed to respond to the asymmetrical tactics of guerrilla warfare. Here, soldiers and military strategy would be replaced by machines, hence reducing U.S. military casualties and alleviating certain aspects of anti-war protest. Data would be collected remotely and in increasingly microscopic detail. Communication would be instantaneous. It would be, as Paul Edwards writes, knowledge without confrontation, power without friction. And we find this research continuing, of course. There's a recent article in the New York Times dedicated to these new robotic devices, and companies such as iRobot, known to the domestic sector of the robot maker of Roomba, might suggest. So just as computers would run the wars of the future, so it seems they would manage those future environments. Architects could now, in effect, man those guard towers, performing their environmental control under the appearance of having withdrawn from the operation. And all this could be tested in the realm of simulation or modeling, in which, to cite Paul Edwards again, systems analysis link choices about strategy directly to choices about technology, thus informing policy decisions and inherently promoting technological change. So to try and understand what might be at stake in the so-called Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde dualism, the supposed antinomy of good and evil inherent to certain trajectories of technological development, and why Negroponte might have recognized ArcMac to be haunted by such a morality tale, I want to come back to the Urban Systems Lab and look briefly at its relation to the Cambridge Project, and hence to the politics of big science and the military-industrial academic complex at MIT, as the Institute steered or claimed to steer its research activities and resources away from war-related projects toward the civilian domain. As the federal government became increasingly concerned with controlling or managing the urban crisis, including not only the physical status of its cities, but the social unrest rising in the face of social and environmental injustices, the Cold War arms race, and the ongoing war in Southeast Asia, things urban, for a short moment, joined military defense and space exploration as the new frontier of federal funding. And MIT cast itself at the forefront of this anticipated urban initiative, understanding its potential contribution through the USL to be that of collecting data and developing programs, technologies, and ever more detailed forms of simulation. That anticipated funding was not, however, so easy to come by, and the program was dropped by 1974. That year, the Tech, as you see here, published a short retrospective article entitled Urban Systems Lab, Social Work since 1968. According to Miller, it explains, when the Urban Systems Lab was founded in 1968, there was the anticipation that urban problems would be approached on the basis of large-scale, mission-oriented projects, as in the space program. These large-scale projects never came about because of funding limitations, never became housing and urban development, never became the research equivalent of the Defense Department. But in the meantime, the DoD, like the Ford Foundation, had emerged as a not insignificant funding resource for certain types of urban studies and their connection to computers, a situation which prompted changes in both the character of research pursued under such grants and their potential applications. MIT's significant contributions to the scientific and technological developments occurring during the Second World War are, of course, typically greeted enthusiastically for their role in ensuring US and hence Allied supremacy against Axis forces. Those who will know, Norbert Wiener and other scientists would famously raise the issue of social responsibility of science in the aftermath of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and would later refuse this type of military funding. But the Institute had also emerged from the events of May '68 largely without incident. Yet beginning with research stoppage in March '69 and exacerbated later that year, MIT became an important target for and site of anti-war protest activities, including by MIT students and faculty, on account of the extensive military-sponsored, often classified war-related research undertaken in its laboratories, and particularly the so-called special laboratories like the Lincoln Lab and the Instrumentation Lab. And the Lincoln Lab and Instrumentation Lab both collaborating on projects with USL. So not everybody would be, to recall Runge in PA, so enamored by the Institute's liberal salting with men whose careers straddle the academic industrial consulting line, those returnees from Washington's elite. And I don't have much time to go into this, but I do want to note two closely interrelated aspects of this story. First, under mounting pressure from the protest movement, MIT attempted to convert the Instrumentation Lab from military to what they called socially necessary projects, or at least to convey the appearance that had done so by changing its name and appointing Charles Miller to direct it in association with USL. Eventually, they had to divest the lab. Second were close relations to MIT's Center for International Studies, the CIS, and with it, Project Cambridge, brainchild of Licklider and Ithiel de Solarpool, under whose auspices we find research involved with the suppression of popular movements that were struggling against US imperialism in both Latin America and Indochina. The CIS had been funded directly by the CIA until 1966, when earlier protests had led it to it being funded through the Ford Foundation, again as a CIA front. So according to Joseph Hanlon in the British magazine The New Scientist, the Cambridge project was the key player in developing computer technologies for data collection and military and policy-oriented research, or behavioral research, policy-oriented behavioral science modeling for deployment in Southeast Asia. Hanlon cited a series of proposed areas of research and data sets that had been set out in the original application to the Department of Defense. And I quote here, problems of underdeveloped countries and on the conditions of stability, studies in peasant attitudes, including under what conditions do peasants' protests become violent, studies on stability and disorder in several countries, analyses of several thousand interviews with Viet Cong conducted by the RAND Corporation, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of studies of youth movements and of Latin American communities. What Project Cambridge offered, he explained, was the possibility of taking data on villages, building a model of whether or not a village might be friendly to US interests, or predicting what type of intervention might help gain its allegiance. Computers, he noted, are already selecting bombing targets in Vietnam, so it's not inconceivable that the model would be used to select the most unfriendly village for bombing. The tools developed by Project Cambridge aim to facilitate more complex wargaming models while simultaneously cutting simulation time down from months to a few hours, hence aiding decisions such as, and I quote, whether or not to intervene in a foreign revolution or election. As part of USL's summer study program, Poole had also been taking these questions directly to be taught in the architecture school. I'll not go over that, but he's literally trying to map this back onto American cities. So I'm sort of heading towards a conclusion here. So in 1974, the Cambridge project was discontinued, or more properly, it was absorbed into the Overlap project sponsored by the School of Architecture and Planning's newly founded Laboratory for Architecture and Planning, called LAP. Funded by the Advanced Research Projects Agency of the DoD, the Overlap project was, as William Porter, then dean of the school, explained, an outgrowth of the Cambridge project. Given the long-standing relationship of Porter's urban data management language called Discourse to the Cambridge project, jointly funded by USL, Negroponte's presence on its board of directors since 1971, and the interdisciplinary environmental research going on in the school, this transfer seems hardly unusual. But it brings us back to the ambiguous status of the political coordinates of this research. In his welcoming remark at an LAP open house in March '74, Porter recalled the idea for the lab, that the idea for the lab had dated to an ill-fated 1971 proposal to establish a Center for the Human Environment, one that had been prepared for the NSF. He also stressed the similarity of the intended research to laboratory methods in the physical sciences, in which scientists constructed representations of the real world in order to permit experimentation where they could not physically get at what they wished to investigate. In LAP, then, he posited they would make interventions into carefully constructed representations of reality, again using computer-based modeling to facilitate the simulation of complex urban and social environments through the incorporation of quantitative data. Such modeling would be accompanied by expensive field research and tested by limited intervention in order to further professional skills. It was hoped that architects and planners could thereby avoid repeating the problems of earlier urban interventions, such as large-scale urban renewal housing projects. Moreover, the school would bring additional visual skills, he argued, to bear on this data. There were, as Porter explained, considerable promise to some of the early efforts to combine the computer with other modes of media for representing and manipulating environmental information, and again, MIT would be at the forefront of this development. Take, for example, and this is the image I showed before as well, ArcMac's famous interactive movie map project, also known as the Aspen movie map, from the late 70s. Funded by the Cybernetics Technology Division of DARPA, the movie map was a computer-controlled optical, sort of analog project actually, a video disc-based system that simulated movement through a virtual environment by drawing upon a multimedia database. Users, and implicitly soldiers of course, as Robert Mole explained, were able to learn about unfamiliar urban space by traveling around at will through sequences of photographic footage and helicoptering above dynamic aerial photos and reference maps. While traveling, they could access other data sources from microdocumentaries, historical photographs, and interior shots to data on statistics like cases of beer consumed per week, etc. With regard to the spatial knowledge the interface was able to convey, Mole added, movie map training leads to superior wayfinding competence in the real setting. So its goal, as Andy Lippman later recalled, was to create so immersive and realistic a first visit that newcomers would literally feel at home, or as though they'd been there before. Referring to what had enabled its funding, he added that DARPA realized the need after Israeli soldiers practiced for the recovery of an airplane hijacked to Entebbe by using an abandoned airfield made up to look similar. So the computer simulation, then, was not quite General Westmoreland's dream of an electronic battlefield. But if soldiers could still enter the actual space of conflict, that territory would be known and strategies tested in advance through computer-controlled environments. Paul Edwards' argument that we should not simply dismiss the implied or actual military potentials of such research as simply grantsmanship, the deliberate tailoring of grant proposals to the aims of funding agencies, seems relevant here, as with many of the other projects that I've been tracing. For even if initially intended as a mere vehicle for obtaining necessary funding, this logic could shift to become what he calls a mutual orientation. In this scenario, just as researchers start to imagine and even project the work's technical capacities into the military regime in appealing for funding, so the military agency comes to recognize new possibilities, hence reorienting both sides of this equation. In 1976, Senator Fulbright cast this slightly differently in a famous article called, or famous speech called The War and Its Effects, the Military-Industrial Academic Complex. Noting what had become an arrangement of convenience providing the government with politically usable knowledge and the university with badly needed funds, he proposed a university which has become accustomed to the inflow of government contract funds is likely to emphasize activities that will attract those funds. So as with the Cambridge project, the Urban System Lab ceased operation in 1974, a moment in which military spending was being cut back on account of the reduction of US military involvement in Vietnam. But by then, in any case, as reflected in LAP, as well as in the interdisciplinary environmental design program founded the year before, absorbing earlier programs, and especially in the ongoing work of ARC-MAC, the school had so fully interpolated other aspects of scientific and technological research, as well as systems-based paradigms and tools of management into its midst, as to make any additional interdisciplinary apparatus largely unnecessary. So I just have one brief conclusion about what we might take from this story. So what I've been attempting to trace here are a series of interconnections at the level of collaborations, of funding, of scientific methodology, and technological tools, which together suggest something more than simple homologies between the characteristics of research undertaken in the social sciences and computer applications at MIT and that in architecture and urbanism. This is, of course, hardly strange, given the shared institutional milieu and its governing mandates, which structured the possibility for such heavily funded interdisciplinary research in the first place. So other key players, of course, in the US in the history of computers, like Stanford and Caltech, did not have architecture schools. So I'm not, to be clear, trying to suggest that we should read all work undertaken at the school as necessarily directed, wittingly or unwittingly, toward military ends, or that it self-consciously operated in the service of national security and the US's broader geopolitical aims, even if I do think it was similarly marked by social, political, and territorial insecurity characteristic of the late 1960s. But I think we might ask whether in some cases architects too had become defense intellectuals, whether in the course of adopting modes of funding and alliances proper to big science and collaborating with centers and laboratories at the forefront of military operations in Southeast Asia and counterinsurgency strategies more globally, that many of these coordinates and skills had become so internalized or naturalized within the practices of these so-called urban technologists as to be pursued without questioning. The question is not whether architects should engage with advanced forms of scientific knowledge and technology. Such engagement has, of course, characterized the discipline's vanguard, occasionally even its more radical avant-garde, although we're not at all speaking of avant-gardes here. Rather, the difficult question remains how, or to what ends, could architects engage such science and technology to politically progressive ends, especially in a situation in which architectural and urban research, and hence pedagogy, in the university had become a targeted area of funding by the military and intelligence establishment and its allies such as the Ford Foundation. The story reminds us additionally that the history of computers and architecture, or computer-aided design, is not comprised merely of a history of graphic interfaces and drawing or rendering techniques. It is, or of the experimental forms later facilitated by advances in both software and hardware. To this we need to add the story of a paradigm shift toward new modalities of environmental management and control, and more specifically the story of the role played, or as it was understood to be played, by the discipline of architecture within emergent paradigms of governmentality developed under the pressures of Cold War politics and expanded domestically with the threat of civil unrest. In the case of computer-aided design, Robin Evans' brilliant demonstration of the manner in which drawing techniques are not only descriptive tools, but formative mechanisms within the practice of architecture might thus be extended to suggest that what's at stake here is to understand and to critically and politically intervene in the ever more structural alignment of the field and its tools with the administration of such mechanisms of control. Thank you. Sorry, a long talk, I realized as I was reading. So.
I think we have time for a couple of quite quick questions.
Okay.
Because there's another class just outside.
Promise to answer briefly.
Hi, Trevor Boddy from Vancouver. Sorry to miss the intro to your talk, but I couldn't help but thinking of the use of philosophy by architects in the 90s, philosophy and philosophism. And I say this as someone who ran around Japan on Eisenman's Anywhere with Derrida and so on. Can't help but think of that vis-a-vis the use of science as a discipline of inquiry as opposed to technology transfer. In other words, it was, at times, I've wondered if there any more cotton onto science than archigram was. There's surely metaphoric use of scientific ideas in the MIT bunch, as there is with archigram. So I'm just wondering if there was philosophy and philosophism in the 90s in architecture. Was there science and scientism in this earlier group?
So in the case of ArcMac specifically, certainly there's many ways to sort of characterize the desire to integrate the research with science. I think that it's not simply scientism in this particular case, because they were actually collaborating with people trained in scientific disciplines who were at the forefront of their fields, and so it was not simply a type of aesthetic or formal appropriation of tropes from science in their work, but certainly in other cases, maybe even in Yona Friedman's case, I think you could say that it looked very, very different, as it had in the early 20th century with characters like Friedrich Kiesler. And so in the particular case that I'm tracking here, the answer is no, and were to be pure scientism, I doubt if they would have received the scale of military funding that they received in pursuing their projects. But certainly, in terms of the behavioral sciences, there were some, in the same period, some very, say, sort of misguided forms of, I'm saying it's all misguided in effect, but let's say less knowledgeable, less sort of integrated within the actual tools and techniques of those fields. So yeah, I think you could make that argument, but I don't think it works for this particular example.
Well, I'll accept that, but
yeah.
What new knowledge did this group create?
Yeah, well, they created lots of new technologies, and they created the knowledge that architecture was a useful tool for the military. I mean, this is, I don't know if this is not new knowledge in the sense that you're proposing, but yeah, this certainly is what came out of it, no question at all. Yeah, so yeah, and they, some of their works. So the very fact, this particular project here was run by a project called Spatial Data Management, and this was the origins of the desktop, the interface that we all have on the desktop computer, with moving information spatially across the surface of the field. So they have an enormous impact in our media environments. Actually, they're really behind much of this. But I don't know if you would want to call that knowledge. It depends what you're meaning by that term. So, yeah. John.
Hi, well, thanks very much. Quite extraordinary range of material. One thing I'm kind of curious about is this relationship of architecture to the military, which on the one hand, obviously has a particular moment here in the US, but, is there in Vitruvius, obviously? It's been a...
What?
Said it's in Vitruvius and so on.
Oh, yeah, it's an old story, absolutely.
Yeah, quite.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so this is just one more iteration.
Yes.
Which I know some people that can be forgotten, and quite often it kind of gets pinned on this moment. But there's a kind of I was struck by the Jekyll and Hyde quote, and that was Negroponte.
Yes.
Yeah.
Negroponte.
Right, okay. Yeah. Because that is a quote which does seem to characterise something about that, this kind of cybernetic dilemma and or paradox. It does seem to have this double master in a way. And one of the things that I'm just kind of curious about your opinion on is because it's absolutely clear, as you've shown so clearly, the relationship of it with a certain strain of US cybernetics and its relationship to the military. Yeah. And I think one of the interesting things which is starting to emerge within a kind of broader historiography of cybernetics today is how it played out across a much wider geography. So, you know,
The East Germany and...
Well, or, you know, in Latin America, and even actually in the UK to some extent, where, and it's kind of difficult to tell whether it's a kind of interesting question, whether, you know, the kind of more nomadic nature of people like Gordon Pask and Gregory Bateson, whether that was, to what extent they were actually pursuing a very different kind of practice, or they just weren't getting the grants. Whether it's a grantsmanship question, or whether it's actually that there was a very different radical tendency within, you know, the bigger framework of cybernetics. So I've been intrigued by people like Andrew Pickering's account, and I wonder kind of if you're familiar with that and what you would make of that, whether you do see, whether it's just a question of, you know, the funding would always divert it in this direction, or whether actually there were quite different questions being posed within the bigger umbrella, if you know.
Yeah.
Sorry, is that quick?
It's a really good question. It's an excellent thing to bring up. And no, I don't think, I mean, I certainly think one can, you know, take money and use it to different ends and, you know, the ambitions of the grant giver, you know, if that's your question, no, absolutely. And again, this particular, you know, part of the motivation for this is that Negroponte is often cast as a, you know, important moment in the prehistory of contemporary engagements with computers, and, you know, so he figures a type of heroic character, and without much questioning of the, you know, actual ethos of his work. Yeah. So it's not to suggest that I want to map that type of position onto all engagements with technology. I mean, I sort of tried to allude to that in concluding, and I certainly don't think that. I do think the question of the scale of funding, certainly in these early moments of engagements with computers, made it difficult to negotiate that space, yeah, but not at all impossible. You know, the old paradigm of inside and against is certainly one, you know, that potentially you could trace. I don't have candidates for that in the late 60s. So, yeah, except for people that were dreaming of using the computer without much actual access to it. Yeah, that's a different. But if you take, you know, Reichardt's Cybernetic Serendipity, you know, exhibition here at the ICA in '68, and, you know, there's many other uses. And I sort of also alluded to that in regard to the software exhibition at the Jewish Museum. And so actually another project I'm working on is on Les Levine, who did a lot of cybernetic projects and was far from collapsible with Negroponte. So yeah, exactly. So totally in Hakke, yeah, exactly, in terms of Hakke's early work. So no question at all. Not trying to tarnish all of cybernetics with the particular ethos of Negroponte's work, but Negroponte is clearly a important character to resurrect with a different narrative, I guess, is what I'm suggesting. Yeah. Mm. Okay, we have to finish.
I'm sorry, we have to make way for another class.
Okay.
So if
I can talk to Ian afterwards.
I'd just like to thank Felicity again, once again, for coming for the wonderful lecture.
Okay, thank you. Let me just dump this file.